Hello, welcome everyone. I am Alyssa Ray, Chief Sustainability Officer of Sustain.Life. This is Week in Sustainability, where our team of practitioners and experts brings to you some of the most meaningful and important stories happening in the news today around sustainability. So I am joined today by fellow colleagues Constance and Nick. Please, Constance and Nick, introduce yourselves.
Hi everyone, I'm Constance Duke and I head our technical practice at Sustain.
And I'm Nick.
Nick. And I'm the Director of Sustainability.
And I'm Nick Lusante. I'm a Senior Manager on our Sustainability team.
Great. Well, today, I think what we want to talk about or kick it off with is probably the most acute environmental crisis happening, certainly in the US right now, but the water crisis of Jackson, Mississippi, which is leaving close to, I think, 150,000 or some counts as many as 200,000 residents without safe, clean drinking water. So Nick, do you want to go ahead and introduce for the group what is going on and why they have likely seen this in the headlines so much over the past several weeks?
Sure. So a few weeks ago, intense flooding in Mississippi strained and damaged two of the main water treatment plants for Jackson. And these water treatment plants had already basically experienced decades of misrepair and lack of maintenance. So, for example, what happened at one plant was the water pumps were disabled, which is normally not a problem at a water treatment plant because they have backups. But the problem here was that they were already running on their backups because the main pumps were already out of service. One thing that happens when you have a lot of flooding is you can have a lot of runoff and contaminated water. So the water is more contaminated than it normally would be, even with things as simple as dirt and mud. And this just makes the treatment of the water much slower. So the slow water treatment combined with the lack of pumping power meant that there was a loss of pressure around the city, and any water that was going out and is still going out is severely contaminated. And you've probably seen images of brown water coming out of faucets. So this crisis really illustrates in plain view the link between infrastructure maintenance and resilience, and climate change, extreme weather events from climate change. More importantly, it also is emblematic of common issues in environmental racism and environmental justice, which is that Black and brown communities are often left with poor infrastructure or less well-maintained, less funded infrastructure. And so when these events do happen, they're adversely affected. And additionally, those types of communities often see a slower response to crises like this. And, it's been a few weeks now. There's still not drinkable water, at least straight from the tap, without boiling in Jackson. And that may continue on for a week or more. And so really, really dire situation down there.
It's feeling somewhat unbelievable or a little surreal to think of the United States of America, huge world power, so technologically advanced. This is not a society that is accustomed to having basic resources truly be limited or threatened in some way for our society and communities, right? This is not a developing nation. We have infrastructure, a lot of urban development, and it's feeling very surreal to have such a basic and critical resource be so endangered for a community. And this isn't the first time we're hearing about a water crisis. I mean, you can't hear about Jackson, Mississippi without thinking of Flint, Michigan, and what is seeming like a recurring headline and narrative that there are these communities, often communities of color, that have underserved, underfinanced, poorly maintained infrastructure systems. And that seems not so dire when you don't have additional pressures placed upon them. But now when you mix this with climate change and increased frequency of extreme weather events like heavy precipitation that are going to further stress these systems, it really, to me, just makes one realize that no one is going to escape the impact of climate change, right? Even the United States of America, with all of our, high standard of living and all of that, our systems are still, is an 100-year-old water system. I was reading some of the stats on this that, it was developed somewhat cheaply. There was some combination of smaller systems kind of being connected together. The materials used weren't necessarily of the highest quality. And that when you think about the life of the infrastructure, like these very pipes, the system has been here for over 100 years, and some of it is designed with materials that were really only meant to stay in place for like 30 years. And it just is a somewhat eye-opening scenario that really highlights the vulnerability of American infrastructure.
Yeah, and that was, a big part of the Build Back Better Act, which didn't end up getting passed, but the version of it that did get passed, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, I think is what they're calling it, which passed in November. A big part of that was, I believe, replacing a lot of lead piping that are in some of those hundreds-year-old systems around the country, and tend to be in poor communities. And additionally, Mississippi actually, ironically, is slated to get over $400 million for the purposes of water and sewage plant upgrades. Obviously, that hasn't happened yet. But even though there is this amount of funding on the table, one challenge for federal lawmakers is a lot of that money is distributed through the state legislature, which in Mississippi is conservative. In many states tends to be conservative as a result of gerrymandering. And there's less control over where that money goes and whether that money goes to actually the communities that need it.
Yeah, and it was also that Jackson's Mayor Lumumba had asked the governor for $47 million just last year to address some of these critical infrastructure failures, and just didn't get a response to that. And it's not that surprising when we're looking at the history of the state. This isn't new. That there are infrastructure issues. The governor of the state, Tate Reeves, is one of the 15 governors who are also opposing the SEC's emissions reporting rules. He's made several kind of climate denial statements during election cycles. So I think there is a little bit of, kind of the lack of acceptance of science, and then also some politicizing of basic services, which is really unfortunate, because with an issue like that, you're looking at generations of failed leadership. It isn't the mayor's fault. It isn't this governor's fault. It's, it should be a bipartisan solution proposed to issues like this. And unfortunately, we're seeing it politicized because the underlying cause in part is climate change.
Yeah. And I was doing some reading across all the various news articles that are in the headlines right now, a little bit about the history of Jackson and its demographic and its population. And it's a really interesting case study for urban ecology, municipal infrastructure, a little bit of history, but to understand all the different dynamic forces in play here that can lead a community to be in this scenario. And again, like, it's not a unique scenario in this country, but that essentially, decades ago, there was a white flight, right? Like, it used to be this big bustling area, and a lot of the citizens, a lot of the demographic, a lot of the money, and a lot of the tax base left. And so you just have less of a tax base supporting this infrastructure. And so it just got dilapidated and kind of neglected over time. And then, we certainly don't need to point fingers, but it does seem like there was a big kind of issue in that they somewhat tried to privatize the water system, and they brought in Siemens to do a big water overhaul in 2010, and that it was just a very mismanaged project, and that essentially the water utility was not properly billing the residents for the consumption of water. Some weren't being billed for like months or even years on end. Others were receiving these hugely extravagant bills for things that they didn't consume. And it was just so poorly managed that the water utility in the city, it appears, basically said to residents like, oh, there's an issue here. We're in a lawsuit with the contractor. Pay what you can. We don't really have a way to remedy this. And all of that, it was just such a mismanaged system. And so they lost so much of the revenue that would have then gone, to collect and support the vitality of this water system. And just really makes you appreciate how critical proper management of these systems of basic resources and access really are, and just, all the different dynamic forces in play and how it can really go so far astray.
Yeah, and privatization always comes up when these types of things happen, which is so unfortunate because you can already see that turning into another environmental justice issue where, you know, residents in, um, in underprivileged communities, can't afford to pay high water prices under a privatized system. So it really should be managed properly by local and state government, but that hasn't been the case in Mississippi at all. And the EPA knows it too. The city's water systems had already failed. One of the EPA inspections back in 2020, the drinking water back then had the potential to host bacteria and parasites. I think there was also an instance where the pipes froze over and burst and introduced contaminants that way. The city has been sued by over 100 residents over water concerns last year. And I think one of the really sad outcomes of this is just like in Flint, even when, the disruption has been taken care of, people just don't trust that their water is going to be safe ever again.
Absolutely. Public trust, I think, is, I won't say the saddest part of this story, but certainly maybe the most prolonged impact that may be actually harder to rectify and build back apart from the physical water system and infrastructure. And this is a slight tangent, but my background in real estate and programs with recycling, we experienced also a collapse in the global recycling market a couple of years ago, with China creating a green fence and no longer accepting a lot of the materials that they took from the US. And it turns out that a lot of the things that consumers were putting in the recycling bin, they really weren't being recycled, right? They were either too dirty or not good enough quality. They were being turned back once they were shipped thousands of miles across the globe to the Chinese ports, and they would go through an inspection test and said, this is not the quality that we want, send it back, putting that many more transit miles and associated emissions on all that material before it ultimately just went to a landfill right back here in the US. But as horrible and sad as that is, I remember working in that industry with recycling consultants and experts in the field saying, like, yes, we are going through a problem right now with the industry, but that doesn't mean that you stop recycling. It doesn't mean that you stop putting it in the bin, right? Because when that becomes the message to the end consumer or to the wide public, you lose all of this trust in the system and the infrastructure. And it takes so long to build that back. And of course, these are different situations, right? Because nobody's health is threatened by throwing something in a recycling bin that may not be recycled in that moment. But I think it just goes to speak to the idea of how critical it is to not just maintain trust, but to also earn the trust in these systems for programs to be successful. And how when you have a failure like this, like going back to Jackson, Mississippi's water, it's not just a failure like in this one distinct or discrete moment. It really has such pervasive effects across communities, in that community, and wider spread of just distrust in what you say is happening, and convincing them that, like, this is the system, you can feel confident and comfortable that this is, what is being provided to you.
Yeah, and how many of those residents in Jackson moving forward, even after the water is fixed, are going to be buying bottled water? How many people who have seen this in the news are going to start buying bottled water because they're skeptical of their city's water, when in reality your city's water, because its quality is enforced by the EPA, is typically much cleaner than bottled water. And it's so we have this weird inversion um, that yeah, will have impacts for a long time.
Definitely. And I remember after Flint, there were kids who basically said, I'm gonna die if I drink the water out of my school fountain. Like it's really sad. It's, such a such a basic um such a basic need that is kind of being destroyed through these events. And I don't know about you guys, I really love movies about this stuff, you know, like a Civil Action or Dark Water with Mark Ruffalo or Aaron Brockovich, all these water movies. And it's kind of interesting how back then the focus was always on companies contaminating the water. And now we have this much bigger force of climate change that, you know, can make this happen on a much larger scale too.
Yeah, it just makes you realize like it's not nefarious. It's just the way of the world. It is this unfortunate and dangerous circumstance that we find ourselves in because of these increased vulnerabilities. The systems were built 100+ years ago when these threats weren't known, and so they couldn't be prepared against. And then, of course, you know, not maintaining them properly over time, it just makes you realize how critical properly maintained infrastructure is. And that's not always sexy, right? Like reinforcing like sewage and water distribution pipes isn't necessarily what's going to get people really excited.
But if you want to talk
I,
about job creation, you know, it's a big source, and
yeah.
that's part of the green economy that we often talk about.
And now
Yeah,
this,
and
go ahead.
yeah, and also look at when it happened. It was like during one of the hottest periods of the year. They were dealing with just unusually high humidity. So it just came at the worst time. And you know, it's another reminder of also how global warming impacts or, you know, kind of corrodes infrastructure even more.
Yeah, I was going to ask, and I don't know if either of you know the answer to this, but in the Inflation Reduction Act, there that tied into the infrastructure bill. I know there was that $60 billion put aside for environmental justice initiatives, and I'm wondering if this would be the type of federal dollars that could be used to support climate resilience, you know, and infrastructure resilience from that funding packet.
That I do not know.
Yeah, I don't know if they break infrastructure out from that, but it certainly would make sense to allocate it there.
Yep. Yep. Okay, well, not the most uplifting news story this week, but I think a really important one to share with our viewers because it is not common that we grapple with this kind of fundamental resource safety issue in the United States. It would be one thing if we were, and we didn't actually even talk about the flooding and water issues going on in Pakistan, but it would be one issue if we were talking about this in, you know, a country that wasn't the United States of America, where I think we often think of ourselves as that's not a problem we have. And I think it's important for us to kind of realize, and you see this, of course, you know, our falling in stature on various global lists of quality of life and, you know, security and healthcare and all these things, but that we've perhaps been resting on our laurels for, you know, some time, and we're starting to see real world examples, you know, not just statistics or studies, but real world observations of the impact of you know, of these neglected systems and what that means for the security of our own country and the people in it, and access to, you know, the resources that we for so long have just taken for granted as being guaranteed, absolutely, you know, by our systems and infrastructure and government, et cetera.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, hopefully we'll have some happier tides for our next conversation next week. We will see everybody next week for more commentary on sustainability stories. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.